Good evening, and welcome back to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Jacob Smagula, and I'm one of your 4 Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Imagine a political landscape where one demographic holds the keys to a nation's electoral destiny, where their vote tips the scales of politics in America. This is not a distant hypothetical, but our present reality. In recent years, Latinos have emerged as a powerful and transformative force in US politics, becoming the second largest ethnic voting group in the country since 2020. Accounting for 70% of the overall population growth between 2022 and 2023, Latinos have been and will continue to be highly influential in local, state, and federal elections. Historically, the Democratic Party has benefited from the majority of the Latino vote. But in recent years, the Republican Party has gained ground, with nearly 40% of Latino voters voting for Donald Trump in 2020, an 8% gain from 2016. This shift raises critical questions. How will the growth of Latino voters impact the current partisan climate? And what will they decide in this upcoming election? What can each political party do to court this critical demographic? To help us answer these questions, we turn tonight to Mike Madrid, a nationally recognized political consultant and expert on Latino voting trends and behavior. In politics, Madrid is a unicorn, one of the rare consultants who has successfully worked on major campaigns on both sides of the aisle. With 3 decades of experience as a Republican consultant, he also co-founded the Lincoln Project, a prominent anti-Trump Republican super PAC. In 2023, he was honored with a Capital Award by Unidos US in recognition of his lifetime service to the Latino community, and served as an adjunct lecturer on race, class, and partisanship at the University of Southern California in the spring of 2021. This year, he published his acclaimed book, The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming America. Currently, Madrid is a senior fellow at UC Irvine School of Social Ecology and a senior political advisor to the New California Coalition. At this time, we ask you to please silence your cell phones and direct your attention to the speaker. As always, video and audio recordings are strictly prohibited. And without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Mike Madrid.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank all of you. It's nice to be on a campus with brilliant minds and people who will be leading and defining your generation. I don't want you to ever forget that. Don't ever forget, as every day goes by, who you're with. Keep those relationships close. I wish I would have kept a lot of mine closer, because you have not only a privilege and an opportunity here, but just an extraordinary blessing to be with the brains that you're with. And so I was sharing with the group earlier, I'm from California. I grew up here in Ventura County. Everybody knows the Claremont schools. This is my first time on campus. And I think we are all keenly aware as Californians that we have this gem, this kind of like crown jewel. And unless we're kind of invited, it's just sort of this place out there. And just the culture, just coming in and having the conversations. I'm envious of your experiences. And I also want to thank you, and thank you, Jack, for starting the conversation here, and for being a good friend over the years, and fighting the good fight over those years as well. I'm here to talk to you about an unprecedented change in this country. And I'm excited about it. I'm very optimistic about where we are heading. And I think there are a lot of people who do not share that sentiment. And I think in large part that can be traced back to some of the extraordinary challenges that we have in our political system at the moment. I want to provide some context on what that demographic change means, what's happening. I'll put some numbers to it. And then I'd like to talk about some of the unique developments that I think that we're seeing. And I also want to leave some time for questions, because if you guys are not aware, there's a presidential campaign going on right now, which is also historic in its own scope. And I know that there are probably some questions that are unrelated, which is totally fine. If you want to talk about the Lincoln Project, if you want to talk about the debate, we've got a debate coming up tomorrow night. The last one didn't go so well for some buddies. I want to leave room for that dialogue and that engagement. Fair enough? Does that sound like a good enough way to proceed? As Jacob mentioned, Latinos surpassed Black voters in 2020 as the largest ethnic minority in the country. And 60% of that group are of Mexican-American descent. And I say that because the conceptions of who Latinos are and the reality of who we are usually two very different things. And it's not that 60% is that big, as I say, it's just that every other group is so much smaller. No other group hits 10%. Puerto Ricans are at 9%, El Salvadorians 7%, Cubans 6%. And then it kind of, most of them sit around single digits, lower single digits. And that is important because a lot of what you hear and understand when we're talking about Latino voters tends to be, oh, it's not a monolithic group. If I had $1 for every time the word not monolithic was used, I'd be a very wealthy man. But most people are referring to country of origin. And I argue in the book, and I think I've been arguing for 30 years in my career, that's not really it at all. That's not the difference at all. In fact, as an undergraduate, my senior thesis was written about the same argument because I was seeing a lot happening in our political system, even in the early 1990s, that didn't quite, I could not quite reconcile with my own experiences. And it was why I decided to come back from the East Coast in my undergraduate program to be a practitioner, to actually work on campaigns as we went through this extraordinary transformation as a country. And I wanted to understand what it was, as I say in the book, that made Latinos both the easiest group to identify on the voter file, but the hardest to understand of any other voter group too. And it's that amorphous nature of what the culture is. And cultures is really the right way to put it. And what I found, even back then, was that if you approached Latinos generationally, how far removed they were from the immigrant experience, you could understand voting patterns a heck of a lot better. Now, this is not terribly unique. It is not unprecedented. In many ways, this is the same methodology and the same experience that this country went through around Ellis Island at the turn of the last century. Are Latinos all that different now than the Italians or the Irish or the Greeks or the Poles? The answer is yes and no. I want to explore some of those because unless you understand both those differences and similarities, you don't understand what's happening in this country. Usually what happened during the turn of the last century, there would be about a 15 to 20 year spurt of huge migration levels. There would be a potato famine, for example, in Ireland, or there would be a political shock in one of the Mediterranean or Eastern European countries, and large swaths of people would come. You would hear these stories of yore about a 13, 14, 15-year-old Italian kid stowing away on a boat, coming, by himself, going through Ellis Island, having his name changed, never seeing his parents again, but finding, his diaspora in Little Italy, and that begins the American journey. That begins the American story. That's not what's happening here exactly. And there are three main reasons why the Latin American experience is much different. And the immigrant experience, I'm going to argue a little bit later on in a few moments, that it's not as important as we think, but we've got to start there for reasons which I think are obvious, because that's the way we talk about Latinos, but also to understand the basic elements of politicization. The first is the length of the migration that has come from Mexico specifically, and Central America, now South America, and frankly all over the world at the current time through the southern border. The Great Migratory, it's really the fourth Great Migratory wave that started with the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, really didn't slow until 2007. Very long, multi-decade inflow of immigrants, Latin American immigrants. So the size was different. The second was where these European immigrants 150 years ago that were coming here were never going back home. A lot of our families go back for the posadas at Christmas. We're going back regularly, right? It's the largest continuous border between a first and third world nation anywhere on the planet, the border between Mexico and the United States. And the culture, especially with technology now, is regularly reinforced on technology platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook. Communications are constantly being held I know I sound like an old guy saying Facebook, but that is the primary medium that is being used. That wasn't just an old guy saying that. That is literally the one that's being used. But increasingly, the TikToks of the world are being used as well. But a lot of the content is being created and generated in Latin America, in Mexican cultures, in Mexican homes, and those conversations are happening regularly. People are in constant contact with each other, and that creates a stilted, if you will, assimilative process. So the size and the scope of it, the proximity, and the continual cultural reinforcement has meant a longer cultural stay than what we experienced. It far surpasses anything that we dealt with in the great migratory waves of the last century at Ellis Island. And this is important. It's particularly important politically because I'm going to give you some of the trajectory of why the parties behave the way that they do, and then we'll get into some of that constructive criticism, and then we'll take some of those questions and answers. But if you look at the trajectory of all of these voters, all of these immigrants, both legal and illegal, coming particularly in the 1990s, what you saw was a backlash to this, as not uncommon as human beings as we do, and particularly here in California, 30 years ago this year, was a very infamous ballot measure called Proposition 187, citizen initiative, which was gathered by people gathering signatures, saying that the undocumented should not have access to virtually any government services, including emergency services. You get into a car accident, you go into an emergency room, no one's going to pay that bill, no one's going to help you out, there's no services, and on and on and on. Very draconian measure. It's kind of shocking for me to realize that was 30 years ago, and most of the people in this room are not 30 years old. But it's also a good reminder that this measure, which was the defining moment of Latino politicization for an entire generation of young Latinos that catalyzed the careers of people like US Senator Alex Padilla, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, 80% of the Latino members of the United States Congress. I could go on and on and on. People that I've worked with over the course of the past 3 decades all began their careers as a result of this measure in response to that, with, frankly, the optimistic promise of bringing in and ushering a new type of politics that was not as nativist, that was not as contentious, that was not as discriminatory, frankly, that wasn't as racist. We'll get into how well that worked out in just a little bit. But I'm also reminded that now, nearly 40%, 38% of all the Latino voters in this country are under the age of 30 years old. 38% of these voters, Latino voters, the second just exploded onto the scene and now surpassed African Americans. Almost 40% of them are under the age of 30, which means none of them have any living memory of this moment, of this defining Latino moment. They have brought with them an entirely new understanding of what minority voters actually are. And it is your generation, this younger generation, that is going to redefine it, not just for Latinos, but I would argue for all non-white peoples. And perhaps most importantly, this will probably be the next area of my study over the course of whatever remains of my career, is white voters are becoming really fascinating. Because as they shrink as a share of the population, we're starting to understand the nuances and the differences of white voters in a way. We never even said white voters up until about 2012 because it was so ubiquitous, it was so large, everything was white. That is not the case. In 15 years from now, 15 years, which is, half of you guys won't even be mid-career in 15 years, America will be a non-white majority country for the first time in her history. It's going to be an extraordinary moment in the American experiment. It's going to test a lot about some basic assumptions that we had about whether or not this is really an idea, this mythology, right? That everybody can come to America and become American. Do we really believe that? Do we really truly believe that? We say it, and it's easy to say, by the way. It's easy to say when 85% of the population is white. What happens when whites become less than half of the population? Do we really still hold true to that? I will tell you right now, we're witnessing a political party whose glue and galvanizing fuel is rejecting that notion. And it's my party. It's the Republican Party. It's redefined what it's going to do, what it's going to be, and how it's going to behave during this time of extraordinary demographic change. As Jacob mentioned in the introduction, 70% of all of these voters it's overwhelmingly US born. This growth, these under 30 voters are not coming as migrants and naturalizing before they're 30 and then registering to vote. They are US born, and they are the fastest growing segment of the Latino electorate is the third generation, and now a discernible fourth generation. When I was a young undergraduate studying Latino politics, there was no discernible fourth generation. It wasn't big enough to study. We didn't conceive of what that was going to mean. We were still struggling between first generation politics and second generation politics. Some of us were looking at this third generation and saying, wow, in the next 25, 30 years, this is going to happen. And that's where we're at with this fourth generation. And so the whole idea of Latinidad, of Latino identity, of your perceptions of ourselves as Latinos is beginning to change. Do my children, who are fourth generation, whose mother is the daughter of German immigrants, closer to the German immigrant experience than to the Mexican immigrant experience, but having grown up in a Latino household, what is their Latinidad any different than somebody who migrated here from a South American country and naturalized over the course of the past few years? Do either of them have a more legitimate claim to Latino identity? And perhaps most importantly, do either of them have a more legitimate claim to a political label, a politicized version of that Latinidad? If you look at public opinion polling, as I have for the past 30 years, one glaring but very noticeable characteristic pops out. Latinos are the moderates in both parties. If you look at the moderate voters, Democrats right now are struggling with this rightward shift of Latinos leaving the party and moving towards the Republican Party. I'll get to that in just a second. But the average Latino voter is much more moderate as a Republican. And I believe that as the Latino vote emerges, in many ways, it's going to have a moderating effect on both parties, because the fight for this fast-growing segment of the vote is in the middle. So how does that explain the Donald Trump phenomenon, right? Mike Madrid, you're so smart, and Latino voters are moderate, but they're voting for Donald Trump. Let me take a little crack at this. I would argue, as I was sharing over dinner, that Donald Trump is actually a hindrance to a greater rightward shift, as opposed to him being the Pied Piper who's bringing them into the Republican fold in the first place. And let me explain the data that I'm using to justify that argument. If you look at Ron DeSantis in Florida, Greg Abbott in Texas, Republican governors, Doug Ducey, the last Republican governor of Arizona, and even Brian Dahle, the sacrificial Republican lamb who ran against Gavin Newsom here in California in 2022. And if you took all four of those governors, very big Latino states, and you took every single one of the top 20 swing districts in the House of Representatives that are represented by a Republican, they all have one thing in common. Every single one of them met or exceeded, in some cases dramatically, the Latino share of the vote over Donald Trump's numbers. Every single one of them. Which means that every single Republican that's on the ballot in this Trump era, where there's a measurable, discernible Latino vote, is doing better than Donald Trump. Every one of them. That's pretty strong evidence, I think, to suggest that Donald Trump is not the Pied Piper who's bringing 8% of Latinos over, but that if he were not in the way and the Republicans had another candidate, you would probably see Republicans getting over 40% of the Hispanic vote. That's remarkable. And it's a remarkably fast shift that has happened from Barack Obama's peak numbers in 2012 that sat around the mid-70s, dropping down to what would essentially be a 60-40 split between a Republican and a Democrat. That is a massive, massive drop, especially in this hyper-partisan era. There is no other voter group that is changing as quickly as Latino voters. More importantly, I didn't use the word realignment. We hear the term racial realignment being bandied about quite a bit. I would argue this is not a racial realignment for two reasons. First, Latinos aren't a race. One, it's an ethnicity. Set that aside. A realignment presupposes that there's already an established voting pattern that is changing. The same way that African American voters in the 1964, after the 1964 Voting Rights Act and after the Kennedy-Nixon presidential campaign shifted from being 75% plus Republicans to 75% Democrats. Or like the Dixiecrats in the Southern strategy, where Republicans realigned the South with Southern Democrats, starting in a strategy in like 1968, 1970, which culminated 25 years later in 1994. It presumes a realignment, political realignment presumes that voting behaviors and values are better reflected in another party and people shift over as a result of those. I'm not seeing any evidence of that. I'm seeing not a realignment, not a shifting of voting patterns. I'm seeing the emergence of something entirely new. I just mentioned that 40%, nearly 40% of these voters are under the age of 30. There's no voting pattern to realign. But it is the US-born third-generation voter, Latino voter, that is moving decisively towards the Republican Party. That's not a realignment. That's the emergence of something that is not described appropriately as a traditional minority voter the way that we have known it in this country. That's the argument. That's what's happening. That's why I titled the book The Latino Century, because this is unique. It does have racial sensitivity. I'm saying it like it's a living organism. This block, and it's not really a block, this group of voters do have more racial sensitivities on issues like a pathway to citizenship, but they are equally concerned as all other Americans about border security. So much so that it gave the political imperative for Joe Biden to sign an executive order restricting asylum and effectively shutting down the border. Within days of that action, ABC polled Latino voters and found 69% of Latino voters supported the executive action. 69%. Do you know what it was for all Americans? 70%. Virtually indistinguishable. Basically the same numbers. At the same time, we're watching this explosion, again, of third-generation voters with a far weaker ethnic and racial anchor. So, yeah, we're seeing something that looks like a typically assimilative voting group, as we did 150 years ago, but at the same time, it is extraordinarily different. So there are shades and hues of what we've learned in the past from our experience as Americans, but what is happening at this moment, in this time, in this geographic space, is unique. It is different. It is unprecedented. And I think it's going to challenge a lot of the basic assumptions that we have about things that we have taken as granted or for granted about what non-white voters are, what non-white voters mean, and are not only redefining our political systems in the process, they're redefining our culture, they're redefining society, they're redefining the workforce, and ultimately the great hope is they will redefine the political parties, because the political parties are behaving and practicing in an old, outdated model, both of them, the same way reacting to them, that no longer exists, and every day that goes by, they are becoming less and less relatable, less and less effective, and speaking less and less to the needs and concerns of this fast-growing group, which is demonstrating that it will certainly not behave the way that it is expected to behave, and it is challenging some, again, the basic assumptions of the way politicians, the parties, and our systems work. So, with that, I'm happy to take questions, or I can go on for another hour.
Hello, everyone. All right.
So if you're interested in coming up to the Q&A, you can come line up behind me or Enya on either side. When you come up to ask your question, please remind yourself to say your name and the school and what you're studying as well. Thank you.
Don't be scared. I'm just going to make up the answers anyway.
All right. First question of the first act of the year. It's exciting. My name's Eli. I am a sophomore studying philosophy and government. And my question is somewhat related to your talk. Given that Latino voters, as you argued, are shifting more to the right and would be doing more so if Donald Trump were not the nominee, how does your work with the Lincoln Project and overall the Democratic Party's work to attract perhaps what would be defined as moderate or hesitant Republicans, sort of two-parter, how do you think that strategy is going to play out in terms of the overall dissatisfaction of right-leaning voters with Donald Trump? And there are a lot of those on this campus. As part of that, how do you think the Harris campaign's rightward shift on immigration will play out with this trend that you've been describing of Latino voters? So with how will it play out with Latino voters with the rightward trend on immigration, and then the overall approach to trying to attract hesitant Republicans? Thank you.
Yeah, no, great questions. Let me say this. Look, we're headed towards what appears, at least at the moment, to be a very, very close election. And I think anybody who's been watching presidential campaigns in this country for the past 24 years knows that most of our presidential contests are extraordinarily polarized. There's very, very little movement, and they usually end up being very, very close contests. And I say that because, as somebody who's spent a lot of time, effort, and energy in my career discerning who those voters are that are truly movable, I will say that there are two distinct voter segments that are at this moment in time. There are two that are measurably moving. The first is college-educated Republicans, white Republicans. Incidentally, I didn't mention this earlier, but make sure I get back to that if I have a way of kind of losing my train of thought. But the racial correlation between Republicanism and whiteness in this country is pretty directly correlate. In California, a state that is 34% white, the Republican Party of California is 80% white by registration. That's remarkable. I mean, that's a very direct correlation. And I say that because the difference in the coalition of the Republican Party, a party that has essentially capitulated on its ideology and on its principles, and has become less of a party and more sort of a following. The one key distinction and difference is college education. So the diploma divide that is changing America's politics is very pertinent to the question. Those in this country with a college degree are far more likely to vote with the Democratic Party or move to the Democratic Party. Those without are equally likely to shift towards the Republican Party. The non-college educated voter has a much higher propensity to become a Republican. Demographically, Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the blue-collar, non-college educated workforce. So we have two voter groups that are moving. US-born Hispanics, specifically men, Latinos, US-born Latino men, and college-educated white Republicans, specifically women. Moving to the left, on cultural issues, the Dobbs decision, climate change, gun control, marriage equality. It's overwhelmingly cultural issues which are peeling college-educated Republicans off to the Democratic Party. This is profoundly different than when I was a young person running campaigns 25 years ago. We always talked about economic issues as a way to bring these voters home. Capital gains tax cuts, free markets, deregulation. We don't talk about that anymore. It's all culture. And those cultural issues are what are forcing college-educated people to leave the party or become very uneasy with it. But the exact opposite is happening with Latinos. So the answer to your question, I think, is convenient for Kamala Harris because the solution to both, incidentally, is the same. Both of them have been concerned about border security, didn't say immigration reform, said border security, and these law and order issues, which is why Kamala Harris is leaning as hard as she possibly can into the prosecutor frame. The very first ad that she ran when she was the presumed nominee in Atlanta was a Republican ad, essentially. I've made a million of them over the past 25 years, talking about hiring thousands of new border enforcement officers, cracking down on transnational gangs, building a wall. Kamala Harris, okay, the Democratic nominee. Now, that's not only where, that doesn't only solve the defection of college-educated voters that were leaving because they trust the Republican Party much more on the immigration issue than they trust the Democrats. What Kamala Harris is trying to do is blunt that. She is not going to be viewed more than Trump as a stronger advocate for border security. She will not, no matter what she does, but she can close the gap. She can't lose by 25 points on that issue and become the next president of the United States. The beauty of the political moment, what she did was she's actually going to where these US-born Hispanic men are going and where these college-educated white Republicans are. That issue, when she closes that gap, she brings both of them home. And that's why she's doing it, okay? And let me be really candid here in political terms. The law and order frame is correlate to the border security frame. They are essentially one and the same in the minds of voters. It's why the Trump campaign is going to launch a withering attack on her, probably starting tomorrow night at the debate, because she's got a record all over the place on this issue. If she does not successfully hold that frame, she's going to lose, and possibly considerably, possibly by a wide margin, okay? She's going to want to try to bring this and talk about abortion issues and extremism. He's going to want to talk about border security and law enforcement. That's what the whole debate will be about, if he can behave and doesn't do whatever else he's going to do in the interim. But that problem, that is why the politics of what she is doing is I think, very astute. I think it's very bold. And one thing I'm actually quite shocked by is the lack of outrage from the left and Latino advocacy organizations, some of whom I work with and have gotten Lifetime Achievement Awards from, who have said nothing, who have been completely quiet and have allowed her to, they've allowed Kamala Harris to run on as the Democratic nominee on one of the most conservative Republican border security bills ever introduced, the Langford bill. That is, we're hearing it's a bipartisan bill. That is not a bipartisan bill. That is Langford's bill. And Biden said, take whatever you want, just get me out of this mess. We'll sign on to it, okay? Langford's one of the most conservative members of the Senate, okay? That is his bill. That is now the policy platform of the Democratic nominee. Hold on, it gets better. The only way this is made possible, the politics is, it's a black woman doing it. A white progressive man could never get away with this. There would be absolute upheaval, absolute. And the beauty of the moment, it's very rare at my age to see truly beautiful political strokes done now. The beauty of the moment is Kamala Harris has set the stage to move her party into a post-racial identity political framework. A black woman could lead her party out of that. The great beneficiary of that, the person who has established her entire career on that, is now positioned best to move her party beyond that. And you're seeing the beginnings of that happening right now. Just brilliant, brilliant. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my answer. Yeah. I'll get to everybody, I promise. As long as my voice holds out. Phoebe. Be disrespectful, it's okay. I work in politics, I've heard worse.
Latino voters voting for Trump, how does that have to do with race or ethnicity at all? They have been born and raised race play a role at all?
That's not only not disrespectful, that's a brilliant question. That's why I wrote the book. That we're redefining this conceptualization, this idea that somehow our ethnicity derives exclusively from our family's country of origin is proving to no longer be the case. Let me give you a quick data point. This is really fascinating. Los Angeles County. This is the largest Latino county in America by a wide stretch. In 2002, 54% of new Latino voters were foreign born. That's a huge number. Exactly 20 years later, 2022, that number was just over 8%. The entire idea of Latinas, Latinos, and Latinidad has forever changed. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think that's a healthy thing. We can disagree on that. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a sensitivity to for where your people came from. I would argue it says a lot more about where we believe that we are going. Let me give you what I believe is a healthy structure. I mentioned Italian Americans at the turn of the last century. The 1990s, there were two of the most prominent New York politicians were Governor Mario Cuomo, who set the standard for being the liberal lion in the Senate. Very proud of being the son of Italian immigrants. In the United States Senate, there was a Republican by the name of Alphonse D'Amato, whose biography was called Pasta and Politics. Very proud son of Italian immigrants. Nobody questioned their Italianness because they disagreed vehemently on 99% of the issues. We have allowed that to seep into the Latino community, especially here in California. And I think it's done incredible damage to our people, to our community, to our political system, and to our cohesiveness, to our ability to get together and work on issues. So if the notion is that you're no longer Latino because you're third generation, I'm not sure if that's what you're arguing.
Not that they're no longer Latino. Oh, sorry. But like, why is like, I guess like, how does race play into it? Because like, you could argue they're like as American as anyone else who was born here. So like, I don't know. I just have trouble understanding like why is the discussion around like race if they're like so I guess like far removed from the immigrant experience. And at the beginning, like you were talking about how like, oh, like immigration and all of this, but it's like so far removed. Not saying that they're not Latinos or like that their ethnicity is not valid, but I don't understand why like the conversation is like
What I'm
centered
saying,
about race when it's so far away.
yeah, what I'm saying is most Latinos in this country, 80% of the growth now, 71 and 80% is US born. And the question you're asking is the right one, which is if race and ethnicity, why is race and ethnicity still a consideration if it's not for these voters essentially? Is that fair?
Yeah, well, because if so great percentage is American, like born in America, then why is it like talking about them as Latinos?
Because they are both.
But no, yeah, but it's like they're like, I don't know, it's like I feel like at that point you can just put them in the same bucket as Americans.
Yeah, what I was just trying to do is explain why you can and you can't. That's the whole point of the book and the argument that I'm making. I mean, you're asking the right question because that's the question before us. And what I'm saying is it's not an either or, it's both. One of the beautiful terms that I heard interviewing young people, people under 30 for this book, well, I'd never heard this before. Maybe you guys have heard it. They would call themselves 200 percenters. Have you heard this term? A couple people? And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm both 100% Latino and 100% American. I am both, which of course they are. But in this country, we have had a need to hyphenate people on one side, or completely say you should drop the hyphen at the border. And when you came here, once you check in at Ellis Island, once you cross the southern border, you drop your ethnicity, quit speaking Spanish, leave that ethnicity behind in the mother country and become American. That's my exclamation point. Become American. And what I'm saying is the size and the scope of this transformation it doesn't allow for that. It's too big. It's too big what is happening. We can be fully Latino and fully American. It's not either or. I reject that.
Well, I guess we can agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for speaking. My name's Eliza. I go to CMC. I was just wondering, obviously in the past with immigrants to the US, we've seen a pattern of rejection by sort of the majority group.
Yeah.
And then we've seen sort of a rejection of immigrants by immigrants,
Yes.
especially with like European immigrants. Do you think that that factors into your analysis of why Latinos are consistently turning out for people like Trump, who maybe have had in the past more extreme views on immigration than the Democratic Party?
That's a great question. There's no question that there's always been about a third of our community that is very, I think could be characterized accurately as anti-immigrant. But again, when you're looking at the changes of the electorate generationally, it's really hard, I think, to make the case that that is the exclusive reason or even the dominant reason. It may or may not be, unless we were able to do some sort of fancy regression analysis in a new method that nobody's ever been able to use before. We probably can't control for that. But let me give you some 30 years of experience with this to make some suggestions about it. Because I also hear some of the same rationale. People will say like, oh, Latinos are machismo. They all want a caudillo. Like they want the Latin American strongman. They're culturally inclined to support these. To which my response is, well, why aren't naturalized immigrants? Why are they voting 75% for Barack Obama? Why are they voting 70% for Hillary Clinton? Why does it take for the third generation before this Trumpiness appears, right? So is it like a recessive gene? Machismo is a recessive gene that skips 2 or 3 generations? The answer is no. The answer is as they become more, take on the characteristics of the communities that they're a part of, becoming more Americanized. We should not be surprised that the Latino blue-collar workforce is starting to take on the characteristics of the white non-college educated workforce when they're working with them on the job site, at the energy patch, on the assembly line, as part of these jobs and industries where republicanism is the dominant political thought, especially when these voters don't view themselves as anything. Pew Research would suggest 2/3 of these voters see themselves as quote unquote typically American, whatever that means. Does that mean they're white? Does that mean they're American? We don't know, but what we can, I think, infer is that what they're saying is, I'm not as ethnically anchored as my grandparents or my parents were. And that's a typical assimilative process. That's the typical assimilative pathway. And so I'm very hesitant about imparting cultural characteristics on the third generation that has the weakest ethnic ties and anchor to a mother country or from sentiment that might have existed somewhere else. I know that's not exactly what your question was, but I have seen in focus groups, when I was doing Antonio Villaraigosa's campaign for governor, I was in Fresno and Bakersfield doing focus groups. I know, it sounds like a lot of fun. We would be interviewing Mexican undocumented, people who'd come here undocumented, then got their residency, then naturalized, who were the most anti-immigrant voters that were supporting the candidacy. And it's always been about a third. A third of Latinos supported Proposition 187. We don't talk about that. A third. Like, it's there. And I don't know if we want to impart that as saying it's white supremacy, if it's nativism, what it is. anti-immigrant themselves. They came here and they want to pull up the drawbridge. Sure, maybe all or part of all of that. But I don't believe that it's a dominant characteristic. I just think that it's probably a part of most cultures or most immigrant groups. It's just most pronounced here because we're so big.
Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, my name is Gabriel Cooley. I'm a freshman at CMC, and I'm studying government and economics. So I guess my question mainly has to do with Puerto Rico, and I guess if hypothetically it becomes a state, right? I mean,
Yeah.
incoming Congress, somehow Democrats hold the Senate against all odds. They take back the House. Harris wins the presidency. They get a trifecta, and they pass a Puerto Rican statehood bill. Do you think that what effect do you think that that would have? Because Puerto Rico is kind of in a weird state where it is simultaneously Latin America and also the United States. Do you think that you'd see that sort of trend happen there, here, or what?
Puerto Ricans are fascinating. Any Puerto Ricans in the room? No? Puerto Ricans? No? The next governor of Puerto Rico may be the head of Latinos for Trump, by the way, right? Republicanism, there's this deep strain of republicanism in Puerto Rico. That's a really big hypothetical, right, to get to all those places. I'm not too sure that it would happen. I'm not too sure Puerto Ricans want it to happen. But I will say, I think that there is there's a growing awareness of what the Puerto Rican diaspora means in the United States, because Puerto Ricans, of course, are Americans, but they don't vote in presidential elections on the island. You can once you come to the continental United States. There are more Puerto Ricans in Florida, your home state now, than Cubans. I mean, right? It's close. The corridor, what's the corridor called, the I-4?
Yeah, there are a lot of Puerto Ricans,
Yeah,
I think, in
Orlando
like
area.
Tampa and
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, Latinos are a bigger voter group than the margin of victory will be in every one of the 7 swing states this year. Pennsylvania led largely by Puerto Ricans. That's the only state that meets that criteria, swing state that meets that criteria. So I'm not too sure what Puerto Rican statehood would mean. And I'm just too worried that it's too big of a hypothetical to kind of make that kind of a guess, because so many things would have to happen the right way to get there. The one thing I do know is if I were making some guesses as to what they would be totally wrong by the time the calculation was actually made. I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's what we say in politics is if there's 2 ifs in your strategy, it's not a strategy. And there's like 5 or 6 to get there.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I mentioned this on upcoming Congress, but I mean, it could be whenever. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the chances of the Democrats picking up the Senate are extremely remote, right? But yes, I mean, that's the best answer I've got for you on the Puerto Rican question. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big hypothetical, so I get it. But thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd reintroduce. I'm Gus. I'm a junior at CMC studying econ and government. I was just wondering. So you mentioned that like as the Latino population just grows and grows, like they are becoming sort of these like moderate cores of both the Republican and Democratic Party. Do you think if, regardless of who wins this election, in 4 years, do you think that like push towards moderation will persist, or do you think there might be further polarization?
I think what's happening, it's a really good question. I think what the potential, and again, this is largely going to be driven by younger voters, is there needs to be a definition and articulation of what a Latino agenda is, because if not, what they immediately do is they'll cast immigration on top of us and say that's the issue. Like both parties and the media can't not help themselves in doing that. So until we start demanding as a community, as a racial and ethnic, and again, it may sound like I'm contrary to what I'm saying, what I've been saying earlier, if you could develop a Latino agenda around economic issues and demand sort of a multi-ethnic working class agenda, whichever party is able to articulate that is going to be the dominant party for the next generation. And that's going to require moderation of both parties. You're already seeing it with the Democrats. I mean, this convention was extraordinary, like I said. I mean, to watch the Democratic nominee run on a Republican platform on border security to talk about the successes of expanding NATO and US involvement in foreign affairs in the world, to talk about American exceptionalism the way that she was, with the exception of abortion rights, that was a Ronald Reagan speech. It was. The coalitions in both parties are changing. And so I think that this demographic transformation is going to play a critical role in that, to answer your question. I don't think it will be like, what is happening is the Democrats are realizing that to win the Latino vote is not by focusing on racial or ethnic issues. That's what they're learning, and they're right, and it's working. The Republicans, they're not learning anything right now because they're stuck with a nominee who's just a disaster for them. And if he wins, and he can win, very possible, that will take the party in a completely different direction compared to whether or not he loses. If he loses, then they'll head in a different direction. I don't think the Democratic Party is going back. I think the Democratic Party, to have a black woman reposition the party the way that she has this decisively, there's no going back. Like this, the idea that Latinos are driven by essentially an open borders policy, and that we are motivated by a racial and ethnic, that immigration is a racial and ethnic imperative for us, has been proven false. They're not going back. And so the problem that the Democrats have had is they are moving further and further away from being a working class party. That's their really big problem. If they can get back into the game there, the working class is Latino. The share of the white working class is shrinking dramatically. The share of the Latino working class is expanding dramatically. And it's one of the problems, I'll let you follow up, sorry to go on here, but one of the real big problems I have with the kind of the DC crowd is they always talk about the working class and they're like, oh yeah, we need Tim Walz. We need Amy Klobuchar. We need Tim Ryan, right? We need Rust Belt, blue collar, working class folk. They're not getting those people back. The white working class is gone from the Democratic Party forever. They're not coming back. They're losing the Latino working class. And they're just kind of like, oh, well, you know, it's probably a polling error. It's not. It's like it's 10 years of a trend line. Like, at what point do you realize you got a problem here? And that's what I was raising the alarm bells on, is their future is Ruben Gallego. It's not Tim Walz. Go ahead.
I don't know if I have time for follow-up. Okay, cool. I'll limit the
Come back up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's David Aguiñada. I'm from El Salvador, freshman CMC. My question is, as politics in the US have become more culture and such, for example, with issues gender and abortion, especially in the last 10 years,
Yeah.
I know Latino households are very conservative, maybe even regarding as part of being very, very religious, like Christian. So as politics become more abortion and gender, etc., for example, is that causing Latino voters and their conservative households to lean more Republican, or is it not as much as a factor?
It's a part of it. It's a good question. Let's explore this a little bit, because this was the first central question I started back in the 90s when I started asking the question. Let me tackle the Catholic question first, because that's the stereotype. Catholicism is collapsing throughout Latin America. It's collapsing even faster here in the United States. There is a rise in evangelical Christianity. The fastest growing segment of the evangelical church community is with Latinos. But for every one Latino that leaves the Catholic Church to go to an evangelical denomination, 2 leave religion altogether. So the fastest growing segment of the religious is the non-affiliated, not atheists, but just kind of like, I don't believe or follow organized religion. And while we are there's gonna be some semantic play here. We are a socially conservative community and culture. It's very distinctly different than white Protestant social conservatism, right? Gay marriage has been legal in Mexico for a long time. Abortion's legal in Mexico. And you don't see like this Catholic uprising there for a whole host of historical reasons, but even academics have been looking at this Catholic question, especially on the abortion issue, for a very, very long time. And there's really not much of a correlation between voting behavior amongst Latinos and a pro-life position. It's clearly not the case post-Dobbs. So I should have mentioned this. This rightward shift that I mentioned that is happening with US-born Hispanic men, US-born Hispanic women are moving as fast or faster towards the Democratic Party, largely because of cultural issues. The question, we have one of the largest gender gaps of any of the race or four largest race or ethnicities. The question becomes why? And the answer is the diploma divide. We have the largest diploma divide between the genders of any race or ethnicity. Our men are overwhelmingly not going to college, our women are. Latino women are going to college at much higher rates than Latino men are, and they're voting appropriately. So Dobbs is becoming a net positive for the Democrats. And they're running abortion rights ads. They're not as afraid to run on those ads the way that they were, and that's actually a very smart strategy, because the more assimilated, that assimilation that is benefiting Republicans on economic populist issue, there's also a benefit to the Democrats on cultural issues. So we do know that the most recently migrated are the most culturally conservative, but again, this community votes 70% plus for the Democrats for cultural and economic reasons. So the cultural conservatism of Latino families is a net negative for Republicans. It's not a net positive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Melanie Haro, and I'm a first-year student. I plan to major in economics, or PPE. So a little backstory with my question. My parents immigrated from Mexico. I'm from Texas. I actually live in a generally conservative Republican town consisting of multiple Hispanics or Latinos. And one assumption or one theory that I've always had is if the over sympathy or empathy towards ethnic groups, especially immigrants, right, from other democratics or other political parties has an effect of Latinos or Hispanics moving more so right or towards republicanism, if this is actually cause towards that, and if it is, how would the, I guess, how do I word this, the removal of this over sympathy or empathy affect the transitions between these political viewpoints, if that makes any sense?
Try one more time.
Yeah, sorry. So more so, this is an assumption that I've always had, again,
Yeah.
considering my background and what I've witnessed. So essentially the empathy, the sympathy, right, that individuals have towards immigrants or ethnic groups, what I assume that they have, right, or what they...
For their own ethnic group?
For, or I guess what I'm trying to, yeah, I guess for their own ethnic groups or generally white people, people who believe that they're quote unquote educated on certain topics that they have towards, again, these immigrants or ethnic groups, right?
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, again, these ethnic groups, immigrants, Hispanics especially, I feel as if have been deteriorated for so long. And my assumption is if this rise in republicanism and right-leaning perspectives is because of their own realizations of their own empowerments, of their own authority, of their own right within the United States. I guess that's just my general theory or perspective on that.
I mean, yeah, I don't know how we would quantify that, but what I will say is broadly, there's probably some grain of truth, or there's certainly some anecdotal evidence that that's the case. I think what I'm arguing is that regardless of the root cause, and I've got my own theories on what is driving this, we know quantifiably that the demographics that are moving towards the Republicans are those that are most like their white, non-college educated peers. And they are telling us in polling data that they view themselves no differently. And so we should not be surprised that they are. So, but where the differences and the distinctions come in analyzing it is going, well, you know, if you're white, we call it toxic masculinity, for example. If you're Latino, we call it machismo, right? And I would argue that there's, you know, I guess a difference without a distinction by the time you're third generation. it's very hard to take these cultural characteristics of the mother country and impart them on the area where the most rapid growth is happening with this community. The immigrant Latino voter is shrinking quickly. Spanish-speaking mediums are collapsing. Univision and Telemundo are in deep, deep trouble. Their markets are collapsing. I think it's very telling that the Democratic Party started their Latino outreach with Latinos con Biden, Latinos con Harris. You go to a Mexican restaurant in Tucson, right? Because of course, that's where we all hang out. You go to, Donald Trump changes his from Latinos for Trump, which it was in 2020, to Latino Americans for Trump. He adds the American in there. It's a brilliant strategy. Why? Because 2/3 of those voters are 200%ers. They're saying, I am both. Don't speak to me as one, because it's telling me you don't understand who I am. When he says Latinos for Trump, it's like, oh, there they go again, thinking that I'm, a Spanish-speaking migrant. When you say Latino Americans for Trump, that's me. I get that, right? And whatever that motivation is, and I think it's a wide array of things, that sentiment, that connectivity, that social tissue is there. I don't know if that's a good answer.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
I'll do my
Thank
best.
you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi,
Hey.
my name is Krish Malhotra. I am a freshman studying economics here at CMC. Something you mentioned while you were speaking was how the Republican Party has shifted from being like more of a party to becoming more of a following. That's something that I've seen as extremely true, especially since we've entered this MAGA era. And it's because it's caused many Republicans become extremely disenfranchised with the party, like me, because we are seeing this radicalism and this following instead of actual policy.
Correct.
And I'm wondering how you think we got to this stage and how we can prevent that from happening in the future on the right or the left.
I think that's a really, really good question. And I think it's central to the survivability of the republic as it exists as a governing structure. But I think more importantly, it speaks to whether or not the American experiment will continue for the next generation. I think the answer to that question is that profound. And here's why. The mythology of America is that we are an idea. We are a belief, and if you believe in a set of values, that anybody can come to America and become American. You hear this all the time. This is our mythology. Politicians love to say it. We're the only country in the world where you can come and be an American. Reagan gave this famous speech about it. That's what made me fall in love with the Republican Party, is the universality of it. It was that our ideas transcend all of these other differences that we have, our economic backgrounds, our race, our gender, our ethnicities. There's a universal belief that we are all endowed with certain rights by our Creator. That's really easy to say when you're 85% white.
Mm-hmm.
Once we're threatened with that numerically and challenged by that, those ideas, that firm mythology that we've held and really believed, I think a lot of us really believed in it for 250 years, when it met face to face with biology, and I say this in the epilogue of the book, people are faced between tribalism and pluralism. And as I argue in the book, the only difference between tribalism and pluralism is perspective. If you believe and you're confident in who you are as a people and you're optimistic and you're comfortable with change and where things are heading, pluralism is your word. If you're isolationist and you're scared and you don't like the change and you become, you want to build a wall, tribalism is your word. And you see that same society, that same diversity very, very differently. One is a strength, one is opportunity, one is hopeful, one sees better days for America. It sees us as truer to our original creed. The other says, this is not America at all. This is what you heard in J.D. Vance's acceptance speech at the RNC for Vice President. He said literally, America is not just an idea, America is a place. That's blood and soil language. 7 generations of my people are buried in the hills of Kentucky. His wife is an Indian immigrant. He left that part out. But that's what he's speaking to, is the idea that we are a white Christian nation. That is our legacy, and that is being threatened. And when you believe that that biology is what defines America, which a wide swath of Americans do at this moment, they see this demographic transformation as a threat, as literally an attack on the country, and that the republic is essentially gone anyway. So why do you have to follow the rules of elections? Because why play by the rules? Because if we lose anyway. So might as well go steal it back and fight back the way the way my ancestors did in the South when we lost then, or the Alamo when we lost then. Let's just keep, build up the mythology of the loser, right? If we're gonna lose, let's just go down swinging like Americans always do when we lose. And that's what Trumpism is. It's mythologizing the loser. Is there are people who feel that they've already been conquered. They've already lost. Making America great again is actually a statement to say it's already over. It's over. Let's try to rewind and go back to something that never really was. And that is against the entire American creed. That's against the entire American experiment. And so that's why I think the question you're asking is so foundational. Is there are half of Americans who believe that America is not an idea. They believe that America is a place, and that there are certain people that it was made for, and there are certain people that should be running and governing it with their own perspective, and that everything else is a threat. And you're hearing that from the 2 nominees on a daily basis. There is another idea and belief in America, which is transcendent, which I believe was what the founders were trying to do, even though they had their own limitations as slaveholders at the time. They were speaking aspirationally on this arc of where we were trying to get to, knowing that even if we never got there, the hope of America, the continuance of the American idea is to keep striving for it. Once you quit believing in the idea, even if you can never get there, it's over. Once you stop believing that it's attainable or that it's worthy to try to pursue it, it's over. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ryan Lenny. I'm a senior here at TMC. I wanted to thank you for your talk, and I was hoping to go back to the Lankford bill briefly and the Harris campaign's shift towards a harsher stance on border security in general. You said briefly in your talk that more progressive groups on immigration have sort of been holding their tongues on the Harris campaign's current stances, but especially around the Lankford bill, I think we saw a lot of more outspoken pushback. Senator Padilla here in California was really outspoken against the bill as well. And so moving forward, if, like you were saying, the Democrats try to hold this ground on border security, do you think we're going to see more pushback post-election? Is it sort of just a grace period right now that people are giving the Harris campaign, or is this a symbol of a wider shift?
It's a great question. I would disagree. I would say that, look at Gaza, for example. That was pushback. It's protest, members of Congress saying, I'm not going to support the President of the United States. We're not going to vote. We're going to try to bring down one of the critical swing states and make sure he doesn't get elected. That to me is pushback. Alex, and I mean, Alex is a dear friend. I think the contrast between Alex Padilla and Ruben Gallego was remarkable. Ruben Gallego, who's in a swing state, Latino, far more progressive than Alex is, crashing hard to the center on border security issues. Let me say this, and I believe this to my core. There is nothing inherently racist about border security. There is a racist way of supporting border security, okay? And we see that in our politics today. And I was on a panel with Julian Castro, who's the Democratic Party was heading down a path, and there will always be those elements that do, of supporting universal health care, for example, for the undocumented. I mean, that's supported by maybe 20% of the American people. Maybe on a good day with a good poll and a good break that direction. That's just bad politics if you're trying to become president of the United States. Alex has the benefit of being in a very blue state where you can kind of have that position. That's not even popular in California, by the way. That's not even popular with Latinos in California, by the way. Okay, that's like when your ideology starts to get ahead of you. That's the same type of thinking where, Ted Cruz will say we ought to arm sixth graders, in Texas schools to protect themselves. Like at a certain point, you have to take a step back and go, wait a second. We have to protect the border. We have to, and that shouldn't be controversial. I'm not saying that you have to agree with the Langford bill or you're a bad person or a good person. I'm just saying politically it's remarkable that they shifted in that direction. And not only was there not an outcry, but you're seeing by a pretty vast majority of Latinos in the party's structure supporting it. I mean, the Democrats created a House Border Security Conference this year. Rubin's a part of that. Tony Gonzalez of Texas is a part of that. Salud Carbajal from Santa Barbara is a part of that. Lou Correa, my good friend from Orange County, is a part of that. I mean, Juan Vargas from San Diego is a part of that. All these Latinos are a part of it because there's, being a part of it, it's not only a bad thing, not a bad thing, it's a responsible thing. Influence the policy. And what's happening is there's a realization that the immigration reform tactic that the Democrats have been employed in since 1986 has been a flawed strategy. It's been wrong. And I know that because I've been fighting alongside of them every step of the way for 30 years. I've been fighting with Alex. I've been pushing Alex to go to the left on some of these issues. There are a few people who think we need more migration more than me, like in massive, massive amounts of numbers. But I also believe we should have very strict border security. I think that's how you get there. And they don't have to be done together. In fact, they can't be done together if the last 35 years has taught us anything. It's not gonna happen. At some point, stop it. So fix what you can. And here's what I think is really fascinating. Here's the hope for the immigration reform movement, which we desperately need. Take the border security piece off of the table and you get to have a clean discussion on immigration reform. And you know what happens? You bring two critical allies that you did not have arguing vehemently for it. The business community that needs labor and the national security community that knows we're in deep trouble if we don't increase our levels of immigration. Those are two salient constituencies in the Republican Party. They're never going to fully engage as long as the Democrats won't move on border security. They were never going to do that. And the reason is neither party has been operating in good faith. Neither party. The Republicans were, granted, but the Democrats haven't either. They haven't. They could have moved a bill in 1993 when Bill Clinton had both chambers of Congress. They could have moved the bill in 2009 when Obama was president and had both chambers of Congress. They could have moved the bill in 2021 when Joe Biden was the president and had two chambers of Congress. Why didn't they? Why didn't they? Because they believed that it benefited them politically. The same way the Republicans withdraw their own damn bill from consideration because they're like, well, wait a second, we don't really want a deal. We're winning this fight. I'm not going to give that to you. That's exactly what the Democrats were doing in 1995 and 2009 and 2021. They were. We can argue, though, whether or not there wasn't a supermajority in the Senate, but you had the votes. Put the bill up. Put the bill up and go fight for it with the American people. Move public opinion in that direction. They didn't want it resolved. They didn't want it resolved. And there is a hypocrisy about this issue, which we all need to be self-reflective about. If Donald Trump ran the ad that Kamala Harris launched her presidential campaign with 5 weeks ago, these same activists in the Democratic Party would be lighting their hair on fire and marching up and down K Street. What were they doing this time? They're listening to Lil Jon or whoever rapping on the floor of the convention and throwing confetti and watching the balloon drop and saying, yeah, thousands of new Border Patrol agents, build the wall. It's remarkable, right? And that's look, I'm old enough in this business to say we shouldn't be shocked by that, but let's just be honest about what it is and what it means and what's happening and then find a solution going forward. I am, and look, I have been very optimistic probably 4 or 5 times in my career when I've been working on the immigration reform piece with these Latino advocates that I'm now saying, be quiet. I've gotten Lifetime Achievement Awards from them. What I'm saying is we need to be mindful that this strategy has not worked for 30 years. In fact, it has failed so bad, you won't even introduce your own damn bills on it when given the opportunity 3 times over 3 decades. So let's just try something different. Let's just solve the problem, get the hate as much as we can off of the board, and let's bring in the National Security Coalition and the Business Coalition to fight alongside of us to potentially get a pathway done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for an incredibly insightful talk and all of your responses. I hope everyone here enjoyed this evening as much as I did. What a fabulous way to kick off our fall 2024 Athenaeum season. Now, if any of you are interested in hearing more and reading more about the topics covered in Mike's amazing talk today, I highly recommend that you consider going to the back of the Ath, where we have several copies of his newest book available for purchase. As someone who got to poke through at least the prologue right before dinner started, I can tell you personally that it's an incredibly interesting read, so definitely check that out. We're gonna wrap up the evening in just 1 second, but if everybody could join me in giving Mike yet another round of applause.